On Thursday, 22 March 1990, in Uccle, South Brussels, the rain leaves a thin sheen on Avenue François Folly, and the apartment lobby smells faintly of wet wool and floor polish. A lift rises, steady and indifferent, toward a sixth-floor corridor. In later press reconstructions, the victim's keys are already in his hand before the danger announces itself. The gesture is ordinary enough to disappear into any building's evening routine. A small detail survives the way the night does not. A reporter's caption line, "Canadian engineer, supergun designer," shot at his own door, repeated across languages as if repetition could substitute for explanation. The corridor carpet absorbs sound. The weapon, in accounts that rely on investigators' conclusions, is fitted to keep the building calm. What happens next is fast, and what follows is slow. The key does not open anything again. By the late 1980s, Brussels is not only a capital. It is a clearinghouse, contracts, subsidiaries, briefcases that never look heavy enough. Gerald Vincent Bull's professional identity is already split by then. Academic credentials on one side, private weapons consulting on the other, and a reputation that makes both worlds uneasy. He is a Canadian engineer with a resume that reaches into American military research and industrial ballistics. And he is also a man whose work has repeatedly migrated toward the edges of legality without ever fully living there. His doctorate came early, earned at the University of Toronto when he was only 23, the youngest person in the institution's history to receive one at that time. The brilliance was never in question. What followed was a career that moved between governments, between continents, between definitions of acceptable use. In this period, his cover is not a false passport so much as a convincing story about himself. That he is still chasing a civilian dream space launch by gun while taking military money, because the dream requires money. The city helps him maintain that story. Brussels offers anonymity through density and legitimacy through paperwork. His company, Space Research Corporation, has offices here. The European Community headquarters hum nearby. Lobbyists and arms dealers share the same cafes without ever acknowledging each other's business. Later reporting describes Brussels as the place where his life becomes logistically simple. Short drives, quick meetings, sealed envelopes. That simplicity is not innocence, it is insulation. In covert work, the safest mask is often bureaucracy, the stamp that says normal. And then the requests start arriving with a different kind of urgency. In the early 1980s, while the Iran-Iraq war consumes money and people, Iraq looks outward for technical solutions that can shift geography itself. Multiple public accounts describe Iraqi officials drawing Bull into a long-working relationship, one in which his engineering obsession becomes strategically useful. There are versions of the story that emphasize the sheer directness of the recruitment. A private aircraft, a discreet pickup in Europe. An invitation that does not sound like an invitation. Bull had already worked with military clients before. In the 1960s and early 1970s, he had collaborated with the United States Army and the Canadian government on the high-altitude research project HARP, launching instrumented projectiles into the upper atmosphere from massive guns in Barbados and Quebec. The dream then was cheap access to space, firing satellites into orbit without rockets. The funding dried up. The governments moved on. Bull did not. By the time Iraqi procurement officials found him, he had already served 4 months in an American prison, convicted in 1980 of illegally shipping artillery technology to South Africa during the apartheid-era arms embargo. The conviction cost him his security clearances, his American contracts, and whatever remained of his standing in polite defense circles. It also freed him. Without clearances to protect, he could work for anyone who could pay. Saddam Hussein's name, in these accounts, sits close to the center of gravity at times, described through his government's defense apparatus, at times through the regime's procurement logic. The point is not whether Bull was seduced or simply paid. The point is that a relationship forms that neither side can later describe as purely technical. The moment a state invests in a person, that person inherits the state's enemies, and Bull's enemies, by then, are not theoretical. By 1988 and into 1989, The work is no longer a concept whispered over dinner. It has a label in public reporting, Project Babylon, with a prototype often referred to as Baby Babylon. Technical accounts describe a segmented barrel design, an engineering choice that makes a supergun manufacturable across borders, in workshops that can pretend they are building something else. The narrative of assembly becomes its own kind of cover. Components can be industrial tubes, oil equipment, hydraulic cylinders, anything that can live inside the ambiguity of export paperwork. British firms receive orders for pipes with unusual specifications. Belgian companies are approached for recoil mechanisms. German machine tools arrive in Baghdad through intermediaries. The segments are designed to be bolted together on site, each piece innocent until joined with its neighbors. A later journalistic reconstruction describes contracts spread across Europe. Another account points to intercepted shipments and belated customs interventions. In the American press, names appear. Engineers and former colleagues who recall Bull discussing captured German Second World War supergun designs. Specialists who argue that Iraq's interest is not romantic, but strategic range, as a substitute for air superiority. The German V3 gun, designed to bombard London from fixed positions in France, never worked as intended. Bull believed he could make the concept work. He had spent decades trying. Sheffield Forge Masters in Britain manufactured large steel tubes. Walter Summers, another British firm, produced additional components. In later testimony, company officials would claim they believed the parts were for a petrochemical project. The paperwork supported that interpretation. The dimensions did not. When a weapon is built in pieces, responsibility is also built in pieces, and soon, the pieces begin to attract attention that does not ask permission. Bull's origin story is well documented. A gifted student who rises early, a ballistics specialist with government ties, a scientist who keeps returning to a single idea launched by gun, as if repetition could solve physics, politics, and money at once. Born in North Bay, Ontario, in 1928, orphaned young, raised by relatives, he channeled everything into mathematics and engineering. His doctoral thesis on supersonic flow earned him immediate recognition. The HARP years were the golden period. Working from a converted 16-inch naval gun mounted on the island of Barbados, Bull's team fired projectiles to altitudes exceeding 180 kilometers, the edge of space. The firings made headlines. National Geographic covered the project. For a moment, the dream of gun-launched satellites seemed possible. But the same equations that send instruments upward can send explosives outward. This is where the dossier's moral complexity begins to tighten. Bull's extended-range artillery work, improving the distance of conventional guns, attracted military buyers more reliably than his space research attracted civilian funders. The GC-45, a 155mm howitzer he helped develop, became one of the most effective artillery pieces of its era, sold to countries whose names later caused diplomatic difficulties. His defenders describe obsession and brilliance. Critics describe a man who kept moving toward whoever would finance him, regardless of the downstream use. Either way, he becomes useful to states that do not ask for ethical nuance. In later commentary, his life reads like a controlled slide. Public science into classified science into private trade into a regime that makes the rest of the world nervous. The target is not only a person, it is a capability that refuses to stay personal. And capability, once identified, is often treated like contraband. By the late 1980s, the strategic argument becomes legible even to outsiders. Public sources note a blunt logic. If Iraq cannot reliably dominate airspace against certain adversaries, it can still build standoff reach systems that punish distance itself. In one widely circulated framing, a supergun is not merely artillery, it is psychological leverage and political theater. Even incomplete, it signals a future. The full-scale version of Project Babylon was designed with a barrel 156 meters long, capable in theory of launching projectiles over 1,000 kilometers. Some analyses suggested it could reach Israel. Others focused on the possibility of launching satellites. noting that Bull continued to describe the project in dual-use terms. The gun would be fixed, embedded in a hillside, requiring massive infrastructure and unable to be aimed quickly. As a military weapon, its utility was questionable. As a symbol, it was unmistakable. Technical summaries describe possible payload concerns and long-range implications. Later, United Nations-focused reporting emphasizes what inspectors would become obligated to ask after the Gulf War: intended use, dual-use equipment, and the way space can be a synonym that distracts from delivery. Israeli officials, in various public statements and attributed comments, expressed concern about Iraqi weapons development throughout this period. Major General Shlomo Areli, in a widely quoted assessment, described the strategic rationale in terms of range and deterrence. The calculus was not emotional. It was geometric. In intelligence work, fear is often written as math: kilometers, kilograms, trajectories. And once fear is quantified, someone is tasked with reducing it. The specific mechanisms of that reduction, if they were indeed set in motion, remain officially unacknowledged. But the pattern of concern was clear enough to read in the newspapers. Before the killing, public accounts describe a pattern that is both banal and intimate. Break-ins that steal nothing. Disruptions that feel like messages rather than burglaries. Bull's son, Michel, in later interviews, described incidents at his father's Brussels apartment signs of entry with nothing obviously taken. Objects slightly rearranged. The message, if it was a message, was legibility itself. We have access. Alongside these accounts are press references to surveillance attention that does not want to be seen but cannot resist leaving a trace. Separately, colleagues and associates later told journalists that Bull mentioned receiving warnings, anonymous telephone calls urging him to abandon the Iraqi work. The record does not provide a neat transcript of those calls. It offers only the fact of their existence, as remembered and repeated by those who heard Bull describe them. Christopher Cowley, a British engineer who worked with Bull on various projects, later stated publicly that Bull had grown increasingly nervous in the months before his death. He had reportedly been offered security protection by Iraqi officials but declined, preferring to maintain his low profile in Brussels. He continued to believe, perhaps, that his technical value offered some protection, that killing him would not stop the project. This is where trust becomes operational. Bull continues to live as if routine will hold. He continues to enter his building, take the lift, turn his key. The domestic rituals remain intact, even as the perimeter erodes. The light in the corridor is the same each evening. The carpet muffles the same footsteps. The first stage of an assassination is often the moment the target decides to keep living normally, and normality, once chosen, becomes predictable. The dossier cannot name the operatives. It cannot truthfully assign faces, nationalities, or unit badges without crossing into invention. What it can do is preserve what is repeatedly reported about method. That the lead-up, as described by investigators and later writers, included a nearby observation position, an apartment rented in proximity, paid for in advance, then abandoned. Belgian investigators, in accounts that emerged in the years following the killing, traced certain movements. An apartment in the same building, or a neighboring one, had been rented some weeks before. The tenant had shown identification, established utilities, created the minimal paper trail necessary to be ignored. Then, after the night of 22 March, the apartment was empty. The rent had been paid through a period that extended past the killing, a detail that some investigators read as professional, to part without creating the urgency of unpaid bills. That detail matters because it is the opposite of cinematic. It is not a chase. It is a cue at an office, a signature on a form, the kind of civilian friction that covert teams plan for and still sometimes mishandle. If the account is accurate, then the operation carries within it a tiny human imperfection. Even professional deception is forced to touch ordinary systems. The cover life here is not glamorous. It is just convincing enough to be left alone. A name on a lease. A face at a counter. Weeks of silence in a furnished room, watching a building, learning its rhythms. Sustained deception rarely fails at the gun, it fails at the desk. And the desk, in this case, may be the only place the file still has fingerprints. On Thursday, 22 March 1990, Gerald Bull returns to his building on Avenue François Folly in Uccle. The time is evening. He has been traveling. Some accounts place him returning from a business trip, others from a dinner. The specific itinerary matters less than the pattern. A man coming home, approaching his door, reaching for his keys. Multiple public accounts agree on the core outcome. He is shot at or near his apartment door, killed at close range, and the weapon is described as silenced in later reporting. The number of shots varies in different reconstructions, 3 in some accounts, 5 in others. The Belgian coroner's report, as referenced in subsequent journalism, indicated multiple gunshot wounds. The back of the head, the neck. The body was found outside his apartment door, the keys reportedly still in his hand or nearby. The building remained mostly unaware in the moment, which is part of what a suppressed weapon is designed to produce, a homicide that does not trigger a building-wide alarm. No one reported hearing shots. The body was discovered later by a neighbor, by building staff. The accounts vary, lying in the 6th-floor corridor. There is no recorded heroism here. There is only procedure, approach, contact, confirmation. The corridor with its neutral carpet. The lift that continued to operate. The apartments on either side, their occupants unaware of what had happened meters from their doors. The quietest killings are engineered not for drama, but for continuity, life downstairs uninterrupted. And continuity is exactly what investigators later struggle to reconstruct. After the body is found, the case becomes a contest between explanation and embarrassment. Public reporting over the years lists a wide menu of suspected sponsors, states that feared the weapon, states that funded the weapon, services that feared exposure, and services that feared the weapon's completion more than they feared scandal. The Belgian investigation, in contemporary and later accounts, repeatedly returns to one prime suspicion: Israel's Foreign Intelligence Service. Mossad. The logic was circumstantial, but coherent. Israel had the clearest motive: the supergun threatened Israeli territory. Israel had the capability. Mossad's history of targeted killings was documented, and Israel, in this telling, had already demonstrated willingness to act against weapons programs that threatened its security. But suspicion is not adjudication, and the file never becomes a courtroom conclusion. When approached by journalists, an Israeli embassy spokesperson offered what press reports described as a standard non-response, no comment on the speculation. That sentence matters because it is both standard and revealing: standard in form, revealing in how much it refuses to stabilize. Other theories circulated. Iraq itself, fearing Bull might be compromised or cooperative with Western intelligence. South African interests, concerned about what Bull might reveal about past dealings. Western intelligence agencies, pursuing their own unstated agendas. The Belgian police investigated. No arrests were made, no charges were filed. The case remains officially unsolved. In unsolved covert homicides, certainty is often the first casualty after the victim. And yet, the operation's strategic effect may be traceable, even without a conviction. If the killing is the visible act, the hardware is the strategic body. Public technical accounts describe Project Babylon as dependent on cross-border manufacturing and shipment segments, machine tools, recoil mechanisms, and specialized components that could be seized if states chose to act. In April 1990, less than a month after Bull's death, British customs officials seized 8 large steel tubes at the Teesside docks. The pieces, manufactured by Sheffield Forgemasters and Walter Summers, matched specifications consistent with the supergun project. The seizure made international news. Suddenly, the Baroque technical details: barrel segments designed to look like petrochemical pipes, exported under vague end-user certificates, were spread across front pages. Additional seizures followed in other European countries. Components intercepted in Greece. Turkish authorities examining shipments. The procurement network, that had operated in the ambiguity of export paperwork now faced the bright light of coordinated scrutiny. After the 1991 Gulf War, United Nations inspections and Iraqi declarations became part of the archival record. Inspectors documented the remains of Project Babylon at the Jabal Hamrain site. Massive horizontal tubes embedded in a hillside. Never completed. Never fired. Baby Babylon, the smaller prototype, had reportedly conducted test firings. The full-scale weapon existed only as components, some assembled, most scattered across continents or seized in transit. Here, cause and effect becomes unusually clear. The engineer is dead, and the project's procurement becomes harder to sustain under scrutiny. Whether the killing ended the project alone is not provable. That it helped compress its timeline is a reasonable inference. Some operations are built so the shot is only the opening move, and the final damage is often measured in what never ships. In the early 1990s, the story expands beyond Brussels into a broader European reckoning over exports to Iraq. The public record includes prosecutions, parliamentary controversy, and corporate names that become synonymous with the era's evasions. In Britain, the Supergun affair merged with the larger Matrix Churchill scandal, a drawn-out investigation into government knowledge of illegal arms exports to Iraq. Ministers had approved export licenses for machine tools that ended up in Iraqi weapons factories. The Scott Inquiry, commissioned to investigate, produced a report running to thousands of pages. Careers were damaged. Policies were scrutinized. The question of what officials knew and when occupied Parliament for years. The German scientist affair, though focused on different programs, reflected similar patterns, technical expertise flowing to Iraq through channels that governments either failed to monitor or chose not to obstruct. Bull's death became one data point in a larger accounting. This is also where the dossier's emotional duality sharpens. The most consequential acts often look like office work. A customs seizure is a form. An export license is a stamp. A court case is a stack of binders. The assassination, once isolated as a hit, now reads as one file among many weaponry, politics, law, and the quiet recognition that whole systems participated. Journalists investigating Iraq's weapons programs during this period faced risks of their own. Farzad Bazoft, an Iranian-born journalist working for The Observer, was executed in Baghdad in March 1990, accused of espionage. Just days before Bull's killing, the atmosphere around Iraqi secrecy was lethal in multiple directions. A covert killing can be a tactic. A procurement network is a strategy. And strategies do not disappear just because one man does. A solved murder provides closure. An unsolved one provides vocabulary. Over time, the case is repeatedly described in public as mysterious, professional, political words that signal certainty without supplying it. Belgian officials, in occasional later statements, sometimes suggest the investigation remains open. Writers sometimes cite unnamed reliable sources who point toward conclusions the official record cannot confirm. The dossier must treat that carefully. It can acknowledge the claims, and it must preserve the absence of adjudicated proof. For the operatives, whoever they were, the record offers no authorized psychological portrait. What it does offer is the shape of their burden as implied by tradecraft, sustained deception, short exposure windows, reliance on documentation that would not survive scrutiny, the necessity of leaving a city without being remembered. If mistakes occurred, if identification was shown, if trails were left, then the human element is visible only as procedural friction. For everyone else, the human cost is easier to see. A dead engineer. A family left with questions. Colleagues who had worked with Bull on projects spanning decades now reconstructing which phone calls might have been the last. His son, Michel, became a spokesperson for the family's frustration, giving interviews over the years, pushing for answers that never came. Bull's wife, Mimi, survived him. The details of her grief are private, as grief should be. What the public record preserves is the fact of continuation. A family that did not receive resolution, a case that did not produce trials, a corridor in Uccle that reset to normalcy the moment the body was removed. In intelligence history, the most honest emotions are often the ones the record refuses to print, and the refusal itself becomes part of what the case means. The final act returns to the first image, not for closure, but for contrast. The address on Avenue François Folly remains a real place in Uccle, a normal street in a normal city, where residents still ride lifts and turn keys. The corridor where Bull died does not announce its history. It does not need to. The violence is not preserved in architecture. It is preserved in reporting, in case files that still carry unknown where the public wants a name, in the memories of neighbors who may not even remember a neighbor died. Elsewhere, the project's remains persist in public view. Supergun components are displayed at military museums, Imperial War Museum, Duxford in Britain, others elsewhere, pieces of an ambition that outlived its architect. They sit under museum lighting, clean, explanatory, stripped of the procurement lies that moved them and the homicide that accelerated their abandonment. Visitors can read the placards describing what the tubes were designed to do. The placard does not mention how the designer died. The contrast is almost cruel. In one setting, the weapon is an object. In another, it is a reason. The dossier ends where it began. A domestic gesture with no innocence left. A man reaching for his keys in a corridor that looked like every other corridor. A building that did not hear the shots. A city that continued its routines while the body waited to be found. The Belgian file remains open. The suspicions remain unchanged. The proof remains absent. A key turns every day in that district. It is never the same sound twice.